Okay, welcome to the Loops podcast. We're really happy to have Dr. Chelsea Hall with us. And we don't want to do a long podcast that's filled with a lot of superficial kind of discussion. So we've talked recently about how can you throw a dart and hit the target. And so, but first of all, welcome to the Loops podcast and to our church. You've been a great blessing to our church. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the dart I want to throw is because you are a licensed family therapist and you have a doctorate of ministry in pastoral counseling. This is something that is one of the more difficult conversations for a pastor. And sometimes maybe we don't have the complete skill set to address it. And that is people that come to us very burdened because they're having suicidal thoughts. So that's the dart. And so I'm wanting to ask you, how should we feel about that in general, not just from a pastoral perspective, but for people who are people of faith having these thoughts? A lot of what goes through their head is how they're feeling about that, which sometimes can be a negative thing, the way they act on that. And then what are some strategies to help people? And then maybe what's some theological underpinnings in terms of those strategies? So that's the dart.
That's quite a dart.
Yes, it is.
I appreciate you clarifying the dart here because it's a wide topic and one that we all have usually a lot of personal feelings about, not just the person who's going through the process of feeling suicidal or like they don't want to be around anymore or that they shouldn't be for some reason. But also for the people hearing that can feel very shocking. So it's an emotionally loaded topic.
There's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have a whole group in distress.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, you mentioned how should we feel? And I think that really highlights something that we don't have to have a should on the feeling.
Let me interrupt you just to make sure we hit that when we say ripple effect. And what you're talking about is if someone is to express that, how is the spouse going to respond to that? How is is that what you're saying?
Yes.
The ripple effect is across the family, maybe in shock, maybe anxious, stressed, because, maybe they didn't even see that coming because the person is internalizing it.
Right.
So that's what you mean when you say the impact is impacting others.
Yes. And it's generally a negative experience that people tend to feel guilty about. Like, oh, I should have known you were feeling that way. And so it can also stimulate some anger. Why didn't you tell me sooner that you were feeling bad? And sometimes this sense of suicidality can creep up on someone in a way like, oh, I've not been feeling great for a while. And then thoughts escalate or something negative happens that kind of cracks that door open. Right. And of course, there's spiritual elements as well. But one of the things that we always want to encourage is instead of trying to fix it, asking questions. So for the person who's feeling suicidal themselves, even, asking yourself some questions like, how long have I been feeling this way? What is the stressor that's happening in my life right now? How intense is this feeling on a scale of 1 to 10? If we're going above 5, we probably need to do some immediate action to help you support yourself, seeking some help, calling a crisis line. None of those things are wrong or bad to do, and in fact, they're very helpful. The people on crisis lines aren't generally paid to do that. They've been through it themselves or a family member has, so they're very compassionate and very effective in getting you through the initial moment. But if someone is telling you, I don't feel like being in here anymore, I don't see the point to being alive, that can sometimes be confusing. On one hand, a lot of people feel like, oh, well, my spouse or my child is seeking attention. And perhaps suicidality is seeking attention but it's the right kind of seeking attention. It's saying, I need help.
Mhm.
Even if you think the person's not serious, we always want to take it serious because you won't know when they aren't, when they
Right.
are serious versus when they aren't.
And that could be why somebody doesn't talk about it, because they're going to think that people think it's for attention.
Yes. And that's actually documented pretty well that most people try to avoid that conversation. So by the time someone finally says this, it's probably been there a while.
Wow. Yeah.
And they need to have their assumptions that aren't correct about how people do care about them, how much they're needed. That does need to be addressed, but not first. First, we have to say, that sounds really difficult. Can you tell me
Right.
more about that?
So when someone states that or expresses that, the best place to start is trying to dig out root causes.
Before the root cause might be more asking, can you tell me more about it?
Yeah.
And they might be like, well, what do you want to know? It's more like, okay, well, how urgent do you feel about this?
Mhm.
Have you attempted to hurt yourself? Do you have a plan in mind?
Yeah.
And that's really hard for people to ask because they tend to think, oh, well, I'm going to reinforce it.
Yeah.
But you're not going to reinforce it by asking it. You're going to
Mhm.
give the person relief. And you also need to find out, now that they've shared it with you, it is your, to some extent, moral responsibility, especially if you're a Christian,
Mhm.
to say, okay, let's find out how bad this is.
Yeah.
And to ask that question. And it won't make it worse to ask that question. In fact, it often makes it better for them to be able to say, oh, I've thought about it a long time, but I don't have any plans. Or, you know, they may say, I've had a plan. I've thought about jumping off X bridge on Saturday for the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And the follow-up question we encourage to that is, wow, what's kept you from doing it?
Okay. So assessing how deep that thought is.
Yeah. And how urgent, like, do you
Yeah.
need to call crisis
Correct.
services right now or
Gotcha.
not?
And then beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
the next step is what? Why are you feeling this way? What are the root causes?
Yeah.
Can we pinpoint some of your dissatisfaction with? Is it with life? Is it with job? Is it with career? Is it with relationships? These kind of questions, because you're trying to get a person to find out what that agitation is.
To some extent. And you're also, by asking questions, you're validating the fact that they're not crazy for feeling bad, that they're not, that it's handleable, because most people don't share that they feel suicidal because of two reasons. One, they feel like they're going to cause problems, which they already feel like they're a problem generally. So that's, they avoid that. But they're also afraid of people not being able to handle it.
Yeah.
And so that can be, when you say, oh, well, tell me more about that. Wow, that sounds really difficult. Just honoring where they're at, that it makes sense. They're not crazy. Other people could feel that way in the same situation. And then you can move to questions. But usually we say avoid the actual word why, even though if you're the interviewer, so to speak, or the pastor or the friend or spouse, you would be asking questions to help. Well, how long has it been there? What's been prompting this? You're asking for why, but you don't actually use the word why. Why tends to be in that setting a very depressive laden word.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's very good. So up to this point, you're wanting them to feel like they're not, it's okay to discuss.
Absolutely.
That it's all right to get this out, and they need that support. And many times they feel isolated in that because all the reasons that we've said, people may not understand. They're worried of what the response would be. And then you're trying to help them come to the why, but you're not saying why. Yeah. Because why kind of feels like an attack, sort of.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they may be trying to answer that question themselves.
Correct.
So that will trigger more anxiety in them, which will then feel more hopeless. And now we're back to square one. Okay.
So when you're at that point, what are some, I guess the next thing would be, what are some strategies to help them move off of that, not to get stuck in that?
one of the first strategies, I think, as Christians, obviously, is offering to pray together. What that does is drives the sense of community and connection and that they're valuable. And obviously invites God to do work that only he can do. But the second thing that often people need is kind of related to the first questions. Do they need safety seeking? Do they need to call somebody? Do you need to sit there while they call someone because you don't feel equal to this conversation? And once you take care of that, the next step is often to evaluate what's missing in their lives, like rest, etc.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
So it's okay to say, this is like beyond what I can offer as a solution or help. You need to connect to somebody that can really help you with this. That's fine. You need to actually direct them that way.
Right. Well, because if you think about it, they're asking for help. They're not asking you to have the answer. They're just saying, I can't figure this out. It feels hopeless. So when anybody, whether it's a counselor, pastor, friend, when you come in and say, you know what, here's what I think would help the most. You're giving clarity, you're giving direction, you're showing confidence that you believe there's a right way to deal with this. They may or may not like the suggestion that you make, but it's okay to express that you don't know what to do, but you know someone does.
Is that common, a hotline?
Absolutely. Every state has their own. Some counties have their own. And of course, there's a national hotline as well. Crisis line is usually what they call it.
Yeah.
And they have text lines now. So if you don't feel equal to a phone call, you can text someone. It's 24/7. And like I said, the people there are well trained, but they're also very compassionate and generally just going to, talk out your emotions. They're not going to try to change your theology or anything.
So strategy wise, that's one strategy. Any others?
Additional strategies are like long-term, like you're talking about maybe a spouse or a friend or someone you're helping in the church repeatedly. Making sure that their basic needs are met. Are they eating? Are they sleeping? Have they changed medications recently? Sometimes there's an element of case management, to put it for lack of a better word, that you might do in terms of checking in with their family or their friends, if you're not family or friends, to make sure that those things are happening. So there's a physical care part, because a lot of times people, by the time they get to suicidality, there's maybe some missing elements in self-care.
Yeah. So on the matter of self-care, what if they haven't told anybody but you? They haven't told their spouse. They haven't told anybody else.
It depends on how urgent it is. If it's the very first time they've had a thought, if they've had the thoughts for a few weeks and they're really resistant to sharing with anybody, like, no, I just want to work this out with you. It's up to the individual whether they think they have the capacity to do that, but also gauging like, okay, well now then we need to make a safety plan. If I'm the only one, I need you to sign a piece of paper that says, here's exactly what I'm going to do if I have this thought and I feel like I have to act on it. If it's low intensity, sometimes that works out fine and they just needed to tell someone, and it, that feeling kind of dissipates once it's not necessary and they find help. Depends
on the intensity of where they are.
If it's really high intensity, then you might have a really serious conversation about the fact that, you have to put safety measures in place for them.
And safety measures in place would be some of the things like we're talking about, hotline, what have you, but it's also depending on how serious it is, you need to be connected with a greater support group, which many times is your family.
Exactly. Yeah. People need to know because, a lot of times people feel like, oh, well, I'm a selfish person. I don't do the right things I should do, so I shouldn't be alive. But they don't realize hurting yourself is actually worse for your family or friend than whatever bad you feel like you're doing now.
Yeah.
Nothing's as final as death. And if you believe in an afterlife, we want to go to heaven. And if we take our own lives, are we not taking everything out of God's hands? And then there's the question of, is it sin? Is it not? And that's why people don't always talk about this struggle. You're not wrong for having the struggle. You're not wrong for not wanting to be here, but you don't want to take it out of God's hands. You want to actually go find some support.
Key point. That's a key point. Yeah. Okay. So last thing, theologically, how can we, I mean, that's obviously one way of framing that, right? The seriousness of heaven, hell,
Right.
the soul, and the will of God, and playing God and taking things out of God's hands, obviously is part of that. What are some other theological underpinnings to, here's some ways that you need to think about this?
Well, one of them that we refer to commonly in counseling, at least Christian counseling, is the story of the prophet Elijah, when he literally told God, "Take my
Yeah,
life."
he's suicidal.
Yeah, I don't want to be here anymore. And God's response to that is really illuminating, because he presents physical care, just like we talked about a minute ago. He gives him strength to go a certain amount of days of travel so that Elijah could kind of process where he's at, just kind of being able to move, be a person, try to have structure. And then he spoke to him after he'd been through a few different experiences to give him hope and future.
Right.
And so a lot of times a conversation with someone who's feeling suicidal is about, acknowledging God has hope and future for you, and there's answers. If we need to hook you up to counseling, if we need to hook you up to some life changes, maybe you need more validation, whatever, then we're kind of modeling after what God did for Elijah.
Yeah, I like that.
And a big part of it's also expressing your emotions. And the Psalms is really common there. We kind of look at that, and some of them are not ended by coming back to feeling okay. A lot of them are really distressing.
Some of them just end with the big question mark. Most Psalms, there's a lot. If it's disorientation, it's disorientation through the Psalm. But at the end, God, you are my refuge, you are my strength. Yeah. So there is some kind of closing, but some there's not. But I think you're right. The Psalms are full of human emotion, and some of it is very strong human emotion. So when we feel those things, we're not abnormal. It's not out of place. It just means we're human.
Right.
And I think the other thing that comes into play too is the laments.
Yes.
The laments are a key ingredient in Scripture. And many times people, they don't want to say that kind of emotion and that kind of language because they think somehow that God can't handle that. Yeah. And the laments say, yeah, he can handle just about anything you could throw at him. So,
and perhaps we get into a suicidal place because we don't have the space or the skills to actually make those laments of our own. And we need to actually model that. Many times I've had clients actually read the laments, read the pieces of the prophet Jeremiah.
That's really good.
And connect to it.
Yeah, that's an amazing strategy, really. Because if you try to do it on your own and you bottle it up, you suppress it, you internalize it, then the thoughts increase in intensity.
Right.
Versus if you take the actual laments and you pour that emotion out through the laments, then it's like releasing the pressure valve.
Exactly.
Very good. This is a major conversation. I know you've probably seen this, obviously, in your practice as a therapist, but it seems like since COVID, the isolation, the separation, all the things that we were doing during that time frame is, I think, when you look back in history, it's going to be a very, very dark day in history. And I don't even think people are completely out of it. I read an article today where 1 in 3 are still having socialization problems.
Absolutely. Because
of COVID. So there's been an increase in just the thought process of people. And so it's increased during that time period. But I think it's always kind of there. Mm-hmm. Any last kind of words? I mean, we've talked about how we should feel about it, what we can do to ward off or activate some strategies, and even some biblical opportunities to release some of that. Anything that you would contribute at the conclusion of our conversation about somebody that may be struggling with that?
Just to encourage to get support and to tell somebody.
Yeah.
Because when you tell someone, not only can they potentially support you, but you also realize the lies that have been bouncing around your mind that you've not told anyone. They're not shameful. God doesn't hate you. There is hope, but sometimes that hope can't come by ourselves.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There's very human. It's all through the Bible. And just to actually have some compassion for yourself, the way that you love everyone else and you want everyone else to be well and you feel like you're not. Take some of that and turn it into your own self.
Right.
Make an action today that proves to yourself that you matter.
Amen. That's awesome. And that's a great way to end. Thank you for spending just a few moments with us. We appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you. It's an honor.
All right.